Saturday. After sleeping wrapped in extra blankets, I awake to a fresh day. The morning is surprisingly delicious. My initial negative impression of Lowestoft momentarily wilts, especially when to my delight I discover that the hotel's dining area looks out to the far-reaching sea and opens onto an expansive esplanade that promises to lead me for a mile or two alongside broad, inviting sandy beaches. The air feels fresh, and there's no odor of processed peas, and for that matter, thankfully, no trace of a sewage smell, a problem that has periodically plagued Lowestoft's seafront and still does. Lowestoft's South Beach has recently lost its blue flag status, an award based upon the cleanliness of the sea's water quality. At the height of its popularity in the Edwardian period, authorities once boasted of spending large sums in perfecting Lowestoft's sewage and drainage so that human waste and what was called noxious vapors from the town did not contaminate the air or leak into the sea. There had also been a concern that the effluvium arising from the North Beach close to the fish houses would interfere with visitors' enjoyment. This dilemma reminds me that throughout history, drainage problems have often compromised many a watering place. A 19th century cartoon, evidence olfactory, from Mr. Punch at the Seaside, illustrates how pervasive the problem could be. The cartoon shows a couple enjoying a stroll by the sea. During their walk, Angelina, proud of her scientific knowledge, turns to her companion, Edwin, and asks, "Do you smell the iodine from the sea, Edwin? Isn't it refreshing?" Overhearing her question, a local fisherman abruptly interferes and with some pleasure dispels her notion. "What you smell ain't the sea, miss. It's the town drains as flows out just here." On this Saturday, such problems seem far away. There's no trace of either processed food or sewage. I long to step onto the esplanade, invite the chilling wind to be my companion, and breathe in the salt air blowing off the North Sea. I decide to venture to the right one day and the left another. The morning is cold. A layer of ice coats the steps. Frost covers the fallen, scattered leaves. Low clouds, illuminated by a rising sun, tarry above a broad swatch of sand going down to a glistening, smooth, silver-like sea. Being the most easterly point on the English coast, this area is reputed to have dramatic sunrises. In this early morning light, the distant, incoming tide forms dark, overlapping lines that, as they draw closer to shore, disperse into expanding elliptical sheets of foam. Except for the occasional dog walker, hardly a person is in sight. As I set forth, a gathering of clouds swirls in swooping curves over the horizon. I take pleasure in the sharpness and clarity of the winter light. An occasional lone runner, taking his morning exercise along rows of brightly colored beach huts, makes his way toward reassuring patches of aquamarine blue sky. In the distance, the silhouettes of two walkers pass through a globe of sunlight beaming like a spotlight on the water's edge. My attention drifts away from the almost empty esplanade and settles upon the open sea where centuries ago one might have gazed at the tangled mass of hundreds of trading vessels. The sails unfurled to catch the wind. The occasional sloop of war or fishing trawlers crowding the ocean and hastening toward the north. An 1812 guide to the town marvels at the constant display of shipping near the shore. witnessed nowhere else in England. The scene, which frequently presents itself of 200 or 300 ships, comprising vessels of all denominations, after having been wind-blown for several days and lying calmly at anchor, when a favorable breeze springs up, every sail is suddenly expanded, and all at the same instant getting under way, eager to steer for their respective parts, beggars description. A stranger would compare it, and not inaptly, to a moving forest. The floating wood sometimes extends to the distance of 9 or 10 miles, the vessels sailing all the way so close to the shore and tacking in such opposite directions. Once, standing in this very spot, a 19th century resident had asked a local fisherman how many vessels he supposed there might be. The fisherman had replied, 3,000 or 4,000, plus 7 or 8 large brigs. The nearest scarcely more than 100 yards from shore. Now, hardly any ship, except the occasional distant commercial freighter, silently and deliberately makes its way along a vacant horizon. But thankfully, the expansive, inviting beach remains, and so does the reassuring, repetitive chorus of the incoming breaking waves, as well as the satisfying sound of the sea's retreating gasp when the water draws back over the grains of sand, leaving pebbles to mark its trail. I pause and listen to the sea inhaling and exhaling, in and out, as if the ocean were registering the rhythmic, somnambulistic breathing of the legendary kraken below the thunder of the upper deep. Will this sea monster, memorialized in Alfred Tennyson's poem The Kraken, awake from its uninvaded slumber and rise from the depths to seize and destroy a passing ship with its colossal, octopus-like tentacles? I also wonder if the turbulence of the incoming tide might not be chronicling the labored movements belonging to the ancient giant sloth, the woolly mammoth, and the spotted hyena struggling to surface from the sea's depths so as to roam these shores once more. Though usually out of sight, these extinct beings are still with us. For not only did the fishing nets once snag remnants of these beasts in their nets, but also, now along this stretch, during massive winter storms, ancient gravel river channels emerge, replete with colossal animal bones and remains of the long departed. Stepping down from the esplanade, I sink my feet into the soft sand and make my way to where the sea has swept over and firmed the surface, allowing an easier passage. After a mile or so, I briefly join a couple walking their 2 dogs that bound in and out of the surf and then shake themselves dry. We chat until we reach a point where the incoming tide blocks any further passage. Not wanting to be cut off by the soft clay and crumbling cliffs collapsing into the sea, we turn and go our separate ways. On the way back, I retrace my route. Alone on the abandoned shoreline, I take pleasure in listening to the breaking waves and gazing at the moving clouds dipping chaotically into the deserted sea. Heeding the rhythm of the surf's movements, I am reminded that recently a group of Lowestoft residents have raised money to erect a bronze statue in honor of Benjamin Britten, the celebrated composer who was born in this town in November 1913 and lived as a youth in a house overlooking the sea. When completed, this commemorative sculpture will depict a solitary 14-year-old Briton seated on a wooden groin while gazing at the ocean and attending to a soundscape that would inspire many of his compositions. If one listens to passages from his Illuminations or to the Sea interludes, played during scene changes in his 1945 opera Peter Grimes, a tragic opera about a Suffolk sea fisherman and the death of two apprentices, one is transported to where Britain lived on the Suffolk coast, to where I am now standing. Recalling the various moods of the North Sea, this music captures the quiet, lingering sweep of gentle incoming waves, leisurely caressing and spreading over the shore. And at moments, lets one imagine the sun's rays dancing upon sparkling patches illuminating the sea. When the musical scales run up and down, they catch the harmonic sequence of the incoming and retreating tides. In other interludes, the timpanis and the tuba's dark, deep tones anticipate an incoming storm that blackens the horizon and ushers in a thickening, threatening sky. One hears the howl of the wind, the sight of the seagulls being blown and gliding above a choppy sea, and the accelerated rush of waves racing to the shore. The music drives the storm like a deep force that heaves, pushes, and swells the sea. Soon, compelled by a chilling, if not frigid, temperature to move along, I retrace my steps and pass by the occasional solitary walker until I reach a modest outdoor seaside cafe, happily including a toilet. The only one I've seen open, where a group of older men, swathed in warm coats, hats, and gloves, sit with mugs of hot tea around a table. Their obedient dogs lie in attendance at their feet. The group's enclosed, relaxed, and familiar posture suggests that they must have known each other for years and that their coming together is a daily ritual, especially during this season when dogs are allowed on the beach. Close by, a line of women, resembling pigeons assembled upon telephone wires in winter, perch on the sea wall outside the cafe. Puffed up thanks to their layers of clothing, they abstain from conversing with one another and choose, instead, to look out to sea so that for a while they might silently surrender to the reverie of the moment, as well as to the hypnotic rhythms of the waves approaching and collapsing before them. Wanting to sit down, I order a welcome mug of hot tea and a cheese sandwich. Eventually restored, I resume my walk. Along the way, I watch a group of adolescent boys who have come to pass the time of day down by the sea. In the midst of their revelry, one of them, perhaps wanting momentarily to assert his presence among his companions' brash banter, picks up and throws a pebble so as skillfully to skim it over the water's surface. Drawing closer to where I set out this morning, my focus eventually turns away from the sea to the populated streets across the esplanade. The reported dreariness, misery, and decline of Lowestoft even more vividly arise before my eyes. I begin more fully to understand not only what the Wolfson Porter warned me about, but also what, 15 years earlier, W.G. Sebald, in his essay on Lowestoft in his book The Rings of Saturn, meant when he had written that the closer I came to the town centre, the more of what I saw disheartened me. Long rows of brooding, tall, dark brick terrace houses and their orderly symmetrical chimneys loom over the vista like giant stern sentinels guarding the land from the North Sea's force. They stare out to sea in a manner that reminds me of the authoritative lines of Moai defiantly facing the turbulent Pacific Ocean surrounding Rapa Nui. Once fronted by beautiful gardens, these cheerless, stolid dwellings almost obstruct and muffle the sea's fluid restlessness and splendor. I walk down a passageway by the side of one of these 5-story buildings. The windows are bricked up or covered in tattered, cheap lace curtains. The brick, once tastefully ornamented, displays the neglect of time. The bright blue bench in front is empty. Further along, damaged stoops, the splintered paint of the doorways, and a confusion of multiple doorbells compromise what once had been a fashionable building. Not many paces away is a local mini-market, open 7 days a week, painted a garish orange. The shop's flickering fluorescent lights sputter through the smudged, cluttered window. Further along, dilapidated bed and breakfasts with, as Seybold suggests, improbable names such as Ocean Dawn and boarded-up former superior hotels or lost pubs such as the Old Crown and Anchor Hotel stand vacant and to let. Strange to think that in June 1878, Joseph Conrad had disembarked near here. Not knowing a word of English, as a Polish mariner, he had signed on as a crew member of a small coaster which was to sail out of Lowestoft. Conrad received his first English lessons from the ship's master. Disheartened by the scene, I proceed toward the South Pier, erected in 1846, a sad, diminished version of the grand structures I have seen in Cromer and Brighton. Hard to believe that in 1902 this pier was once considered to be one of the finest in the kingdom. Because it is now severely damaged, access onto its extended walkway over the sea is forbidden. Once this pier had featured a reading room, a bandstand. The band played pieces of a very select nature. And in the 1950s, a miniature railroad that had run the length of its walkway. On rainy days, the reading room must have been a haven for those who wished to be close to the sea. With the exception of a solitary angler who casts his rod into the choppy water below, not a soul sets foot on what's left. At the pier's entrance, a family entertainment center, though open, displays dim signs of life. I find it difficult to comprehend that up until the 1950s, this site would have been among the resort's major attractions. Older postcards show crowds of fashionable and refined holidaymakers mingling at this very spot. One from the Edwardian period shows this polite bustle of activity. But now, in the adjoining plaza, a merry-go-round stands still. Next to it, two brave souls, defying the unsettling wind, sit at a table outside a closed fish and chip establishment. Except for an elderly person boldly moving forward on his mobility scooter, not one person passes in front of the well-weathered Triton statue depicting Neptune wrestling with a large fish. No wonder a recent visitor commented that this site was hardly worth the time. Funding is currently being sought to secure the pier's future. Not in a mood to linger, I cross the promenade and walk toward a faux Victorian Crystal Palace, opened in 1993. what must have been some developer's attempt to attract tourists. This edifice of glass and steel, called the East Point Pavilion, reminds me of the Winter Gardens in Great Yarmouth. Though far younger than that once grand edifice, this too was in disrepair and stoically awaiting its probable demise. Closed since 2016, its roof needs replacing, and so does its heating, ventilating, and electric systems, not to mention the toilets. In the lowering sun, this deserted pavilion seems a ghost of itself. However, much to my surprise, one small section is actually open and functioning as a modest cafe. Curious and thirsty, I dart in. Seated and enjoying an Eccles cake with a cup of tea, I watch a group of seagulls impatiently pacing back and forth on the deserted tables outside. They peer through the pavilion's glass panes as if begging for food. Being the only customer, I chat with the worker, a young woman born and bred in Lowestoft. It's a pleasure to hear her share how much she loves the sea and the clouds that roam above it. Months later, I learn that government funding is soon to rescue the building from demolition. By June 2022, the renovated and refurbished East End Pavilion will open to much fanfare. It has become a restaurant, a food hall, and an events establishment. Unfortunately, when I revisit Lowestoft in March 2023, I am disappointed to find the pavilion to be not any livelier than when I was last there. A handful of people order takeout from various fast food booths. Even fewer sit at wooden tables. I miss the place as I had experienced it on a mid-December evening in 2019. If I had passed this way in the 1840s and 1850s, I would not have seen the East Point Pavilion, but instead would have gazed in awe at the Grand Royal Hotel, a first-class establishment that included a well-appointed restaurant, coffee rooms, a billiard room of noble dimensions, a conservatory partly filled with exotics and with native plants chiefly indigenous to the horticulture of East Anglia, a well-supplied newsroom, salt and fresh water baths, and a handsome mews. This is where, under the proprietor, Mr. Samuel Hewitt, people of rank, the swells in yachting costumes and charming English girls, as well as comfortably off valetudinarians, stayed for a month's holiday by the sea. Management boasted that the Earl of Cardigan made it his occasional headquarters, bringing his beautiful yacht, the famous Enchantress, and surrounding himself with several eminent fashionable friends and military acquaintances. As seems to be the fate of many Lowestoft institutions, though, this splendor did not survive forever. Despite extensive refurbishments in 1954, such as an extension to the dining room, the hotel suffered some decline. The final blow came in the early 1970s when the building failed to conform to fire regulations. In the end, it was cheaper to pull the hotel down. As I returned to my lodgings, I watched the approaching night lovingly spread a blanket over the sea. What light remains charts the skeletal lines of the damaged pier. Once back at the hotel, I discover that the manager has placed a radiator in my room. After a pleasant enough dinner in the dining room, I retire and read myself to sleep in a warm bed.